When Jonathan knelt before Helen in that park, he knew that the decision he was about to make would change his life forever. What he didn't know was that the real test was yet to come, a test that would challenge everything he had learned about love, sacrifice, and the value of things that money can't buy. Jonathan Myers, a name known in the social columns of New York City, rose from his Italian leather chair with a champagne flute in hand. The night was his. His 35th birthday was being celebrated in grand style at his mansion in the Hamptons, with a breathtaking view of the city that seemed to bow before his greatness. The house, a modern palace of marble and glass, glowed with the splendor of crystal chandeliers and priceless art. Every detail of the party was meticulously planned, reflecting Jonathan's extravagance and refined taste. While the guests danced to the sound of a live band and chatted about business and social media, Jonathan moved through the room, greeting each person with a confident yet superficial smile. He knew what everyone said when he wasn't around. Jonathan was a successful man, but also obsessed with appearances. He had it all: money, power, and an endless line of stunning women. But he had never experienced true love. It was amid this setting that Jonathan re-encountered Michael Anderson, an old childhood friend with whom he had lost touch over the years. Michael didn't fit into Jonathan's new life. A renowned lawyer, Michael maintained values that seemed outdated in that environment. He came from a middle-class family, and despite his professional success, had never let himself be corrupted by the false glitter of the elite. Michael observed Jonathan from a distance, analyzing with critical eyes what his friend had become. As the night wore on and alcohol loosened tongues, Michael eventually approached Jonathan, his gaze a mix of concern and determination. "Jonathan," he began without ceremony, "have you ever thought about what really matters in life?" Jonathan laughed, finding the question comical in that setting. "Are you serious, Michael? Look around. All of this is what matters. Success, power, beautiful women. What else is there?" Michael shook his head, disappointed. "You're surrounded by people who only care about what you can offer. When was the last time someone stood by you because they truly cared about you, not what you have?" The question caught Jonathan off guard. He was used to compliments, to being the center of attention, but Michael's words left him uneasy. However, he quickly masked his discomfort with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, Michael, you've always been an idealist. I live in the real world. And in the real world, this is how things work." Michael stepped forward, a sparkle in his eyes indicating he was about to do something unexpected. "Then prove it. If you think you know so much about the real world, I want you to accept a challenge." "A challenge? What kind of challenge?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to marry someone who doesn't fit your standards of perfection. I want you to marry Helen Parker." Jonathan frowned. The name wasn't familiar to him. "Helen Parker? And who is she?" "Helen is a literature teacher, intelligent, witty, and obese." Silence fell between the two men. Jonathan stared at Michael, waiting for him to say he was joking, but Michael remained serious, challenging. "You're kidding, right? You want me to marry an obese woman?" "What's the catch here, Michael?" "There's no catch," Michael replied firmly. "I want you to see beyond appearances. I want you to prove that you're more than this superficial man I see before me. If you accept, maybe you'll discover something about yourself, something that's buried beneath all these layers of wealth and status." Jonathan was silent for a moment. The idea seemed absurd, but at the same time, something inside him was touched. Maybe it was the challenge, the provocation, or simply the desire to prove he could win over any woman, regardless of her appearance. He took a deep breath, trying to hide his growing discomfort. "All right, Michael, I accept your challenge. I'll win over Helen Parker and show you that I can do it." Michael smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I hope this is the beginning of something you never imagined, Jonathan." With that, the two friends parted ways, but the impact of Michael's words continued to resonate in Jonathan's mind. The party went on, but for him, the event had taken a different tone. He had accepted a challenge that seemed simple, but would begin to change his life in ways he didn't yet understand. The morning after the party brought the usual hangover, but for Jonathan, there was something else bothering him. Michael's words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had gotten himself into something much bigger than he initially imagined. Sitting at the marble table in his kitchen, with a panoramic view of the city still waking up, Jonathan contemplated his next move. Helen Parker, he thought, rolling the name around in his mind. She was an enigma, a variable outside the norm in his meticulously controlled life. Never before had he had to make an effort to win someone over. Women always came to him, attracted by his money, his influence, or simply the superficial shine he emitted. But Helen, from what Michael had described, she wouldn't be like that. Jonathan picked up his phone and did a quick search. An image of Helen Parker appeared on the screen. She was smiling in a simple photograph, wearing modest clothes, surrounded by books in a classroom. Her eyes shone with an intelligence and kindness that surprised Jonathan. She wasn't like the women he knew. There was no lust in her gaze, just a serenity that seemed to come from within. And, of course, there was her physical appearance, a woman above average weight, far from the standards Jonathan normally considered attractive. For a moment, he almost gave up. What was he trying to prove, after all? But then Michael's challenge came back to his mind, and he felt the need to move forward. Maybe there was something he could learn from this experience. Or, at the very least, it would be an interesting story to tell later. Determined, Jonathan asked his personal assistant to find out where Helen worked and arrange a casual meeting. The next day, he was at the door of the school where Helen taught, waiting for her to come out. Dressed in his best suit and sunglasses, he stood out among the parents and teachers leaving the place. When Helen finally appeared, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach. She was exactly like in the photo, perhaps even more captivating in person. There was a grace in her movements, a serene confidence that contrasted with her modest appearance. "Miss Parker," he called out, approaching her with a confident smile. Helen turned, surprised to see a man like Jonathan there. "Yes, that's me, and you are?" "Jonathan Myers," he replied, extending his hand. "May I offer you a coffee?" Helen raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Coffee? Why would a man like you be interested in having coffee with me?" Jonathan let out a laugh, trying to maintain his composure. "Let's say I'm curious. I'd like to get to know you better." She hesitated for a moment, looking at him as if trying to understand his intentions. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I know a place nearby." They walked together to a small cafe down the street. The place was simple but cozy, with wooden tables and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Helen seemed at home there, greeting the attendant by name and choosing a table near the window. Jonathan, on the other hand, felt out of place in such a modest environment, but tried to disguise it. "So what really brings you here, Jonathan?" Helen asked as the waiter brought the coffees. "I told you I was curious," he replied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "You're different from the people I usually meet." "Different how?" Helen challenged him, keeping her gaze steady. Jonathan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You seem genuine, and that's rare in my world." Helen laughed, and a sound sweeter than Jonathan expected. "Genuine? You say that as if it were a rarity. Maybe in your world it is, but in mine, being authentic is a necessity." Jonathan felt disarmed by her response. He was used to being the master of the game. But with Helen, he felt the rules were different. However, this only increased his determination to continue with the challenge. The minutes passed quickly, and the conversation flowed with a naturalness that surprised them both. Helen was witty and full of stories, many of which left Jonathan laughing genuinely. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to impress or maintain a facade. He was just being himself. When they finally got up to leave, Jonathan realized there was something in Helen that he didn't find in anyone else, a disarming honesty that made him question his own choices. "It was a pleasure, Helen," he said, holding the door for her. "The pleasure was mine, Jonathan," she replied with a smile. "But don't think I don't know what you're trying to do. I just haven't figured out why yet." Jonathan swallowed hard, surprised by her perceptiveness. "And what do you think I'm trying to do?" Helen shrugged, enigmatic. "I'm still figuring that out, but when I know, I'll let you know." She walked away, leaving Jonathan standing on the sidewalk, reflecting on what had just happened. He was no longer so sure about what he was doing, but one thing was certain. Helen Parker would not be easily won over, and that only intrigued him more. The days following his first meeting with Helen were strange for Jonathan. He tried to focus on his business, the endless meetings and social events that filled his schedule, but the image of Helen and her disarming way of dealing with him kept invading his thoughts. Every time he tried to rationalize Michael's challenge as a simple matter of pride or proving he could win over any woman, something inside him resisted. Helen made no effort to impress him. She didn't wear excessive makeup, didn't dress in designer clothes, and definitely wasn't interested in his fortune. She was authentic, and that was something Jonathan didn't know how to handle. For the first time, he found himself in front of a person who wasn't interested in his facade, but in who he really was inside, something he wasn't even sure he knew. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful meeting, Jonathan found himself driving aimlessly through New York City. Without realizing it, he ended up in front of the school where Helen taught. It was almost dismissal time, and he parked the car, waiting without really knowing what he hoped to achieve. When Helen finally came out, his heart raced. She looked tired, but still carried that calm smile he was beginning to realize was one of her trademarks. He got out of the car and approached, calling her name. "Jonathan." Helen seemed surprised to see him there. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to say hi," he replied, feeling a bit silly for not having a better excuse. Helen studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his intentions. "All right then, let's walk." They began walking side by side with no defined destination. The conversation was light at first, centered on trivialities, but Jonathan felt there was something more he needed to understand. "Helen," he began hesitantly, you always seem at peace with yourself. How do you do that? How do you manage not to care what others think?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. "Jonathan, the truth is, it wasn't always like this. There was a time when I cared, a lot. But living life trying to please others is exhausting and, in the end, doesn't bring happiness. I learned to focus on what really matters, being true to myself." "But that's not easy," he murmured, almost to himself. "No, it's not, but it's liberating," she replied, with a sincerity that hit him like a blow. "And you, Jonathan, what really matters to you?" The question caught him off guard, and he didn't have a ready answer. All his life, he had pursued wealth, power, and status, believing that would make him happy. But now, in front of Helen, those things seemed empty. "I don't know," he finally admitted, feeling vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. Helen stopped walking and turned to him, looking into his eyes. "Maybe it's time to find out. You spend so much time trying to be someone for others that you may have forgotten to be someone for yourself." Jonathan remained silent, absorbing her words. He was used to being the man who had all the answers, the leader who always knew what to do. But with Helen, he felt lost, as if he were finally facing truths he had avoided for a long time. They continued walking, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the impact of Helen's words stayed with him. Jonathan knew there was something in Helen he needed to understand better, something that could change the way he saw the world and himself. In the following days, Jonathan began spending more time with Helen, always finding excuses to see her. They met for coffee, lunch, or simply to walk in the park. Helen took him to places he would never have visited alone, small corner cafes, cozy bookstores, and quiet parks where she spent hours reading. Gradually, he began to appreciate these simple things, finding in them a peace he had never experienced in his hectic life. However, despite Jonathan's good intentions, he couldn't avoid the doubts that arose in his mind. Was he really changing, or was he just trying to fulfill Michael's challenge? And what did he really feel for Helen? Was it possible that a man who had always valued external beauty above all, was falling in love with a woman who defied all his superficial standards? These questions tormented him at night, when he found himself alone in his luxurious mansion, surrounded by everything money could buy, yet feeling emptier than ever. He realized that Helen was changing him, but he didn't know if he was ready to accept that change. And deep down, he feared what it would mean for the man he believed himself to be. Jonathan's encounters with Helen became more frequent, and over time he began to realize that Michael's challenge was no longer just a matter of pride or proving he could win over any woman. There was something about Helen that deeply moved him, something that made him question everything he believed about what truly mattered in life. One afternoon, as they walked through a quiet park in the heart of New York City, Helen suggested they sit on a bench under an old tree whose leaves swayed gently in the breeze. She seemed a bit more introspective than usual, and Jonathan, now more attuned to the nuances in her expression, noticed that something was bothering her. "Helen, is everything okay?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. She sighed, looking at the horizon before answering, "Jonathan, have you ever wondered why you accepted this challenge?" The question surprised him. He had thought a lot about it over the past weeks, but had never clearly articulated his motives, neither to himself nor to her. I think I wanted to prove something," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Prove that I could change, that I could see beyond appearances. But the more time I spend with you, the more I realize that maybe this challenge was just an excuse for something I needed to face a long time ago." Helen kept her gaze fixed on some distant point, as if considering his words. Finally, she turned to him, her expression mixing sadness and acceptance. "Jonathan, I need to tell you something that's not going to be easy to hear," she began, her voice low and controlled. "There's a reason why I've been so reserved, why I've never fully opened up to you despite everything we've shared so far." Jonathan's heart sped up, a mix of fear and anticipation gripping him. "What is it, Helen?" She took a deep breath before continuing. "A few years ago, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness. It's a condition that has no cure, and although I'm doing everything I can to manage it, I know it will limit my life in many ways. I've been dealing with it alone, and one of the reasons I keep people at a distance is because I don't want to be treated as someone fragile or incapable. I want to be seen for who I am, not the illness I have." Jonathan felt a knot forming in his throat. Her words hit him with the force of a punch, and he realized how unprepared he was for this revelation. He had always seen her as a strong, independent woman, someone who didn't need anyone to protect her. Now that image was being challenged, and he didn't know how to handle it. "Helen, I didn't know," he murmured, feeling helpless. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I didn't want it to define what we have," she replied, a slight bitterness in her voice. "I know how people react when they find out. They change. They start treating me differently, as if I were breakable. I didn't want that from you, Jonathan. And, frankly, I didn't know if you were prepared to deal with something like this." Jonathan remained silent, emotions swirling inside him. Part of him wanted to run away, to distance himself before things got even more complicated. But another part, a part he was beginning to recognize as true, didn't want to lose Helen. She was different from all the other women he had known, and the idea of living without her now seemed unbearable. "Helen, I don't know what to say," he finally admitted, the honesty in his voice reflecting his internal confusion. "But I know I don't want to lose you. Not over this." She looked at him, surprised by the sincerity of his words. "Jonathan, this isn't something easy. I don't want you to stay with me out of pity or guilt. If we're going to continue together, I want it to be because you truly want that, knowing everything." Jonathan felt a wave of conflicting emotions. He didn't know if he was prepared to face a life alongside someone with a chronic illness, but at the same time, he knew that Helen had become indispensable to him. She had changed him in ways he never imagined possible, and the idea of letting her go now seemed like a terrible mistake. "Helen, I need time to process all this," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "But I want you to know that I care about you, more than I even understand." She nodded, understanding the internal struggle he was facing. "I know this is hard, Jonathan, and I don't expect you to make a decision now, but I needed to be honest with you." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Helen's revelation had changed everything, and Jonathan knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he found himself willing to face these difficulties, not because of a challenge or pride, but because he was beginning to realize that maybe Just maybe, he was falling in love with Helen, not for her appearance, but for what she represented to him. As the afternoon turned to evening, they got up from the bench and began to walk back, the silence between them laden with new meanings. Jonathan knew he was on the verge of a decision that would change his life forever, and although there was still uncertainty, one thing was clear: he didn't want to lose Helen. In the days following Helen's revelation, Jonathan plunged into a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He found himself at a crossroads. On one side, the man he had always been, who valued superficiality and external shine. On the other, the man Helen was helping to emerge. Someone who was beginning to see the world through a deeper and more meaningful lens. He spent hours in his mansion, pacing back and forth, trying to find a solution to his internal dilemmas. Helen didn't pressure him, but the distance he had created between them was noticeable. She had given him space, but Jonathan knew that this distance couldn't last forever. Eventually, he would have to make a choice. One night, while looking out over the illuminated city of New York from his balcony, Jonathan picked up the phone and called Michael. His friend answered after a few rings, and there was a slight surprise in his voice. "Jonathan, what's going on?" "Michael, we need to talk," he replied, his voice laden with seriousness. "About Helen. About the challenge." Michael agreed to meet him the next morning at a discreet cafe, away from the eyes of society. When he arrived, Michael was waiting with a concerned look, knowing his friend was facing an internal battle. Jonathan sat at the table, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Jonathan sighed deeply and began to speak. "Michael, I don't know what to do," he admitted, feeling the weight of the words. "Helen? She's incredible. But I don't know if I'm prepared for what that means, for what the future holds." Michael remained silent for a few seconds, considering Jonathan's words. "You've fallen in love with her, haven't you?" Jonathan didn't respond immediately, but finally nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and dread at admitting it out loud. "Yes, but..." "But what?" Michael prompted gently. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough to face everything that comes with it. Her illness, the fact that our time together might be limited, that she'll need more than someone who just admires her from afar. And the worst part is, if I commit and fail, if I disappoint her. That's what scares me the most." Michael looked at his friend, realizing how much Jonathan had changed since accepting the challenge. There was a vulnerability in him now, an openness to feelings and experiences he would have previously dismissed. "Jonathan, what you're feeling is normal. The fear of losing someone we love, the fear of not being enough. But what you need to ask yourself is, who do you want to be? The man who runs when things get tough, or someone who faces these challenges because the person beside you is worth it?" Jonathan listened to Michael's words attentively, letting them resonate within him. He knew he was facing a crucial decision and couldn't keep avoiding it. "I don't want to be the one who runs," he murmured, more to himself than to Michael. "But how do I know if I'm ready?" Michael smiled, a smile reflecting understanding and empathy. "No one is ever truly ready, Jonathan. We just decide it's worth trying. If you love Helen, there are no guarantees it will be easy, but if you run now, you'll be losing something you might never find again." Jonathan knew Michael was right. And despite all his fears and uncertainties, he felt a growing determination within himself. He didn't want to be the man who gave up when things got difficult. He wanted to be someone who fought for what truly mattered, and now he knew that Helen was that person. "I need to talk to her," Jonathan said, standing up from the table. "I need to be honest about how I feel, and I need to do it now." Michael nodded, proud of his friend. "Good luck, Jonathan. Remember, it's the heart you put into it that matters, not the fear." Jonathan left the cafe with a new clarity of purpose. He drove to Helen's apartment, his heart beating fast, but with a determination he hadn't felt before. When he arrived, he hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Helen opened it, surprised to see him there, especially at that hour of the night. She noticed the seriousness in his eyes and knew that something important was about to be said. "Jonathan, what happened?" she asked, sensing a slight tension in the air. "Helen, I need to be honest with you," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I love you, and it scares me because I know what we have won't be easy, but I don't want to run from it. I don't want to lose you." Helen looked at him, surprised and moved. "Jonathan, please, let me finish," he gently interrupted. "I know I have a lot to learn, that I have fears and insecurities I need to face, but I want to face all of that with you, not because of a challenge or pride, but because you're the person who makes me want to be better. I want to be by your side, regardless of what the future holds." Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes, touched by the sincerity and vulnerability he was showing. She knew this decision hadn't been easy for him, but she also knew he was being genuine. "Jonathan, I never wanted you to stay with me out of pity or obligation," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But knowing that you want to be with me, despite everything, that means more than I can express." He approached her, holding her hands firmly. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know I want to face it with you. Together." Helen smiled, the tears finally escaping her eyes. And together, then, they embraced, a hug that sealed the commitment they were making, not just to each other but to themselves. Jonathan knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face those challenges head-on because he had finally found something and someone worth fighting for. The months that followed Jonathan's confession marked the beginning of a new phase in his life. He and Helen began building a relationship based on trust, understanding, and above all, genuine love. It was a period of adjustments where both had to learn to deal with the insecurities and fears that naturally arose. For Jonathan, this process was particularly challenging. Accustomed to solving problems with money and influence, he found himself facing issues that couldn't be bought or easily resolved. Helen's health was a constant reminder that life was fragile and unpredictable, forcing him to reevaluate his priorities. Helen, in turn, continued to be a source of strength and inspiration. Even on days when the illness debilitated her, she kept her spirits high, refusing to let her condition define who she was. She taught Jonathan to value simple moments, a walk in the park, a quiet night at home, or even an honest conversation at the end of the day. These were the things that, in the end, truly mattered. The contrast between their lives remained evident. Jonathan still attended social events and maintained his presence in the business world, but he now did so with a new perspective. He no longer cared about impressing those around him. His priority was always Helen, and this was something his colleagues and acquaintances began to notice. Rumors about the new Jonathan Myers started to circulate, but he didn't care. For the first time, he was living for something beyond himself. One day, while Helen rested at home after a particularly difficult week, Jonathan made a decision he knew would change the course of their lives forever. He took her to a special place, a small hidden park in the middle of the city, where Helen liked to read under an old tree. It was a simple place, but for them, it held deep significance. As they walked in silence, Jonathan stopped and turned to her, holding her hands. "Helen, there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, a slight concern in her eyes. "What is it, Jonathan?" He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I've spent my entire life searching for something I didn't know was missing, and when you appeared, suddenly everything started to make sense. I know our life together won't be easy. I know there will be challenges, and that things won't always go as planned. But Helen, I can't imagine my life without you." Helen felt her heart race, anticipating what he was about to say. Jonathan knelt before her, taking a small velvet box from his pocket. "Helen Parker, you've taught me what true love is. You've shown me that beauty goes far beyond what the eyes can see, and that true wealth is sharing life with someone who truly matters. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, facing whatever comes together. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Helen's eyes. She looked at the man before her, one who had changed so much since the day they met, and felt an overwhelming wave of love and gratitude. "Yes, Jonathan," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "I accept." Jonathan placed the ring on her finger, a simple symbol of their commitment but laden with meaning. They embraced, and feeling that this was just the beginning of a new journey together, a journey they would face side by side, regardless of the challenges they might encounter. Time passed, and while Helen's health fluctuated, their love only grew stronger. Jonathan stood by her every step of the way, learning to value each moment, each victory, no matter how small. And amid all the challenges, they found a happiness that many search for their entire lives without ever finding. Finally, on their wedding day, in an intimate ceremony surrounded only by close friends and family, Jonathan and Helen sealed their commitment before everyone. It wasn't a grand or ostentatious ceremony, but it was perfect for them, full of love, simplicity, and the promise that together they could face anything. As Jonathan looked at Helen at that moment, he realized that Michael's challenge, which initially seemed like a silly provocation, had been the greatest gift he could have received. He had found true love, not in a woman who fit the superficial standards he once valued, but in someone who made him see beyond appearances, who transformed him into a better person. And so, hand in hand with Helen, Jonathan was ready to face the future, an uncertain future, yes, but full of hope and love, because, in the end, he had discovered that true beauty, true wealth, lay within the soul, and that was the only thing that really mattered. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button. See you next time.